Welcome, everybody. Hope you're having a good day. I know afternoon lectures start to get a little more difficult to sit through, and this is an hour-long lecture, and I'm going to try to cover a lot of material, but before I start, I just want to introduce myself. My mentor, who's Dr. Nancy O'Hara, a long time autism advocate physician who's taught me a lot, taught me that when I'm speaking to a group of people, I should let them know who I am and how I got here. So again, I'm Tracy Fritz. I'm an MD, family medicine certified, and I practice in St. Louis, Missouri. And what got me here is my daughter, Louisa, and that's Louisa with my husband, Barney, her dad. And our journey in the autism world started when Louisa had a regression after a vaccine injury and got a diagnosis of autism. That was in April of 2009, and I attended my first conference here at Autism One in May 2009, where I heard my very first lecture on the biomedical interventions for autism from Dr. O'Hara, and it opened up an entire world to me, a world that I was grateful existed because my child was very ill and I knew something had happened, but I didn't know how to get her better. And none of the physicians in my life at that time knew how to get her better. They told me that she was needing long-term care, that of course I should do, therapy interventions and special education, but that her husband, her dad and I, we were both at this visit, unforgettable, as I'm sure many of you know, and that we needed to plan for long-term care for her, and that she was an attractive child, and that would help her in her life. And as a physician, I knew that that was not good medical advice, and I knew that she had been well and then became sick, and I felt like it was our duty to find out how to reverse that. So for those of you who may be here for the first time with a new diagnosis, you're in the right place, I assure you. And for me, it's a real honor to be here speaking to parents and other professionals after this 7-year journey. And Louisa has made remarkable improvements. She's a gift, and she has taught me more than I could ever teach her. Okay, so what am I going to talk to you about today? I'm going to talk about the endocannabinoid system and treatment implications in autism. So what am I talking about? And what I'm hoping to explain to you by the end of the talk is the following. Cannabidiol, which is also referred to as CBD. What is CBD? What is the endocannabinoid system? How does the endocannabinoid system work? And then how is this ECS related to autism spectrum disorder? How can we use CBD to treat autism spectrum disorder? And then how do we actually put it into play for patients? So CBD, again, I'll call it CBD from now on because it's so much easier to say. It's a phytocannabinoid, and what that means is it's a plant that's phyto, derived from a plant, and it's a cannabinoid. That's the type of molecule that it is. It's derived from agricultural hemp, and you just saw an ad about that. The plant's name is Cannabis sativa L. Hemp has been used for over 100 years. It's refined into products such as hemp seed foods, hemp oil, wax, resin, rope, cloth, pulp, paper, and fuel. Hemp is nutrient-rich, it's eco-friendly, and it's sustainable. And this is what our friend hemp looks like. It's a tall, stalk-like plant, like bamboo almost. And so hemp is not marijuana, and there are many lectures going on over the next couple of days about medicinal marijuana for autism, and those are very valuable, and I would encourage you to attend them if you have interest in this area, which you must because you're here. But what I'm talking about is derived from agricultural hemp, and it's available in all 50 states, and it's considered a nutritional supplement, so it's really accessible for families to be able to use. I practice in St. Louis, Missouri, where medicinal marijuana is not legal at this time, and so this is how I approach using the cannabinoids to help symptoms of autism. So marijuana is also a cannabis plant, but marijuana contains THC, and THC causes psychotropic effects. It also has very beneficial medical effects, but has to be, used very carefully, and you have to be in a state where it's legal to use. So just to clarify, hemp does not contain any THC, hemp is not psychoactive, and hemp products, including CBD, have a really excellent safety record. So as a practitioner, I feel comfortable using it. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a nutritional supplement available in all 50 states. So just for fun, here's some molecular structures. The THC, you can see is on one side, the CBD is on the other side, and there's really only one difference. There's an oxygen bond and then there's a hydroxy bond. So they're very similar in structure, and they have similar properties. Okay, so the endocannabinoid system. So endo means inside our body. So this is our own system, and it's based on these cannabinoid substances that are in our body. And what it does, it's a central regulatory system that's designed to maintain and restore homeostasis. And what is homeostasis? It's the tendency of an organism or a cell to regulate its internal conditions, usually by a system of feedback controls, so as to stabilize health and functioning regardless of the outside changing conditions. So just to say that in a different way, it's balance inside the body and balance of the body as it relates to the environment. When you have homeostasis, you're in a state of well-being. And when you lose homeostasis, you're in a state of disease. So the ECS regulates homeostasis through a wide variety of mechanisms, including facilitation of intercellular communication between different cell types. And that just means that this system of molecules that's regulatory helps different cells in the body talk to each other so the cells do the job that they're designed to do. And in our kids who have autism, their cells aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing all of the time. So what makes up the ECS are cannabinoid receptors. Those are in our body. We're made to have them. And then, these fancy words, endogenous ligands. These are binding molecules. And again, endogenous, we make them. They're from inside our body, and they are designed to bind to these receptors. And then to keep that process working, there's enzymes. And these are little proteins that make the binding molecules. And then when we don't need the binding molecules anymore, they break down the binding molecules. So we have these receptors that I mentioned in our body, cannabinoid receptors, and these are labeled. The first one that was discovered was called CB1, and we now know about CB1 and CB2. They're found throughout the entire body, but they're distributed differently because they do different things. So CB1 receptors are concentrated primarily in the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, but they also exist in the tissues in the rest of the body called peripheral tissues. And CB2 receptors are mainly found in the peripheral tissues, especially in the immune system. But they're present also in the central nervous system. Again, really important system when you think about autism in terms of a neurological, immunological disorder. And so here's a picture that shows in green the CB1 receptors, again concentrated in the central nervous system in the brain, and the CB2 throughout the periphery. And then there's many locations where you have both CB1 and CB2 receptors. Okay, and this is a little detailed, but I think it's important just to be fully informed and understand what we're talking about. So we have our receptors, and now we need something to bind to them. And so the two molecules that were first discovered, and this was in 1992, this is relatively new medicine. I mean, we didn't even know about this system. Of course, it was there and it was working or dysfunctioning, but it was discovered in the late 80s, early 90s, and in 1992 they discovered the first endocannabinoid, so this molecule that we're making to bind to the receptors, and they gave it the name anandamide. And so it's interesting because we make this molecule, it regulates all the systems in our body, and it happens to have a very similar structure to THC, which grows in cannabis plants. They discovered another one called 2AG a couple of years later, and kind of backed into discovering the CB2 receptor because they found this molecule and said, well, it must bind somewhere, and then they found the receptor. And I noted a few additional endocannabinoids that have been discovered with very long, difficult to pronounce names, and so it's just an area that's exploding in terms of research. And then we have enzymes that, as I mentioned, that make these binding molecules, and then when we don't need them anymore, they break them down. And I think it's important to talk about all the different parts of the system, because if the system gets broken and isn't working, you have to try to figure out where that breakdown happened and try to address it and fix it to get it working right. So this is a graphic that shows the process that I talked about. And I don't think I have a pointer. Oh, maybe with the mouse I can. But basically, this is the CB1 receptor. Okay, first of all, this cell that we're looking at is a neuron, and we call this the presynapse. That's where the signal starts. It goes across this little thing we call a cleft, and then the postsynapse is where the action happens. So if you're a cell and you have a job to do, you're going to send the signal from this side of the cell across here, and then that cell's going to take some action and do what it's supposed to do. And this communication through all cell types is modulated or regulated by the endocannabinoid system. So you have a little CB1 receptor right here, and down here you have your endocannabinoids that are going to bind to it. And there's a feedback loop when you have when the cell does the job that it's supposed to do, the process will stop. All right. So, and I mentioned this already, but I think it's worth repeating, because this statement, the ECS affects all systems, all organs, and all tissues to promote homeostasis. So it's all encompassing. It's really a great target for treatment when you have children that have a disorder that is impairing all of their functioning throughout their body systems. So, and again, this is what I was describing in the graphic, but cells communicate. Neurotransmitters, again, these are the signaling molecules in our brain from the presynapse to the postsynapse, and all of that interaction is modulated by these endocannabinoids. And here's the issue. If that system gets disrupted, we need to figure out how to go in and fix it. So an example would be if the neuron, you have neuroexcitation, a neuron's firing too much, it's releasing too many neurotransmitters, and maybe you're having stimulation or a lack of focus. Your endocannabinoid system should sense that. It should send that feedback back to the presynapse, and it should down-regulate the signal that's making those neurotransmitters get released. And that relies on the endocannabinoid system to do that. So when your endocannabinoid system is working, a good example would be if you get a tissue injury, a cut, you step on a rusty nail. The endocannabinoid system takes action. It will decrease the release of activators and sensitizers to the injured tissue. It will then stabilize the nerve cells to prevent excessive firing, which will be counterproductive. It'll cause a lot of pain, for instance. And it'll stabilize immune cells to prevent the release of pro-inflammatory substances. So these are three different mechanisms of action on three different cell types for a single purpose: to minimize the pain and the damage caused by the injury and to promote healing and a restoration of homeostasis. That's when it's working. And this is another graphic. And I went through a little this one. I wish I would have waited, because this one's a little bigger and easier to see. But again, I'll run through it so you can hear it twice. But so calcium's like an on-off switch in the cell, and it'll signal for neurotransmitters to get released. So here our neurotransmitters are getting released. We have our CB1 receptor. Down here at the end, at the synapse, we don't want that to get released anymore. So the endocannabinoids feed back onto that CB1 receptor and say, hey, cool it with releasing the neurotransmitters. And there's a picture in that graphic of the structure of those two naturally occurring molecules that our body makes. Okay, that's Louisa. I thought everybody after that graphic might want to laugh. Okay. So how is this system related to autism? And I talked about this a little bit. You know, when you have neurologic dysfunction and immune dysfunction, you've lost your balance. Your endocannabinoid system is not working like it's supposed to. And there's been study in trying to look at the endocannabinoid system as it relates to autism. And often we do studies using a mouse model, because our brains are actually very similar to mice, and so we can learn a lot in these animal studies. And I just listed 3 studies here that are of interest, where they made a mouse model, they did some genetic modification so that they could study the effect of these genetic mutations on the endocannabinoid system, and found that the endocannabinoid system was disrupted based on genetic changes that we know are associated with autism. And one of the things that was found in one of the studies was that people with autism have an upregulation of the CB2 receptor. And when it's not working properly and it doesn't have the endogenous, the substances that we make there to bind appropriately, it can cause a very pro-inflammatory state like we see in our kiddos. So what we call that balance and the secretion of our own cannabinoids is tonic secretions. You know, we put out more when we need to and less when we don't need to, and the system kind of knows how to control itself, but we lose that in ASD, and we lose our homeostasis. What do we see? We see dysfunction in the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord, and the nerves that come off of it. We see a lot of dysfunction in the gastrointestinal system. The immune system becomes dysregulated, and our hormone system, called our endocrine system, gets dysregulated. And again, in a properly working endocannabinoid system, all of these organ systems are interrelated and communicating and modulating each other. And when you lose that, you get massive dysfunction in all areas. So you want to restore the balance of the endocannabinoid system to provide relief of the symptoms that our kiddos experience when they're in this state. And so here's the good news. We have a source from plants that we can supplement our body, supplement our endocannabinoid system with what are called exogenous endocannabinoids. So endogenous we make, exogenous we get from somewhere else. And where we get them is Mother Nature through plants. So this is that same graphic, except the difference is that up here is the structure of a plant-derived cannabinoid, CBD, again from hemp. And you can see that it has a very similar structure to that anandamide and the 2-AG. And if you don't have that feedback from the postsynapse on the neuron to bind that CB1 receptor and say, hey, cool it with the neurotransmitter release, you're not producing that naturally. You can take CBD oil and have that substance available to bind that receptor when it's appropriate to help regulate and control the systems. So, and what's interesting too is there's nice literature that you can just do a PubMed search, which is open to anybody on the internet, and put in cannabis, and you'll get almost 1,000 articles. This is well studied, not necessarily in this country, but in a lot of other countries, and more study is underway. So I think we're going to continue to learn more and more, which will be excellent in terms of targeted therapies for our kids. So we do know that using CBD to try to modulate the endocannabinoid system provides relief of many symptoms. I'll get into a little more detail on that. It promotes neurogenesis, so the repair and production of neurons. It provides neuroprotection, protecting the cells that are in the central nervous system. It's a potent antioxidant, and our kids with autism have high oxidative stress. They have a really difficult time with that, and we use a lot of supplements geared at being antioxidants. This is another one in our toolbox. It supports neuromodulation. I just talked about that for quite a little while, so for the nervous system to regulate itself properly, and it also has a nice anti-inflammatory effect, and that's really immune modulation, and our children have a lot of challenges with proper immune modulation. So one of the areas that I see the most benefit when I use this clinically in patients is the reduction of central nervous system symptoms, repetitive behaviors, appetite disturbances, and I see a myriad of both eating excessively, which is that word hyperphagia. Some of our kids just don't seem to have that shut-off switch. They're hungry all the time and want to eat and eat. Versus some of our kiddos have trouble with appetite. They have restricted eating and really don't have much of an appetite. Sometimes nausea and sometimes fear of vomiting. That's more in my patients who have a diagnosis called PANS, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it happens in children who have autism at a higher rate than in other children, but it's another neuroinflammatory disorder where the immune system inappropriately attacks the brain. Mood disturbances, anxiety, depression, OCD, aggression, rage, seizure, self-injurious behavior, and sleep dysfunction, which obviously is a huge issue for a child with autism. And in my mind, one of the very first things that I address when I see a new patient, and I mean, I know this because I lived it, you know, our kids often sleep 2 or 3 hours a night, and then they're up for the other 20, 21, and do it night after night. When your body is trying to maintain or restore homeostasis, you need sleep. You need to be in an appropriate level of deep sleep where you can, your brain and immune system and the rest of your body can communicate and try to restore balance. And if a child's not sleeping, there's no hope of having that happen. And it's nice that CBD can correct sleep disorders from the get-go. I have a lot of success with it in that area. And then, of course, GI symptoms. Those are so prevalent in our children. Immune symptoms and endocrine symptoms. And this is, I saw this outside, so I borrowed it, but, you know, this is just a pie graph that's showing you other endocannabinoids that have been identified and studied. And CBD really does a lot, and that's the reason that I put that there, and I've mentioned a lot of them already. So how do I go about using this if I identify a patient who I think will benefit from it? Again, because it's a nutritional supplement, I can use it at any time for any patient. It comes in multiple forms, and there's a lot of vendors outside these doors who have products like this, and I typically prefer to use it in an oil form. One thing is it's a molecule that is called lipid. It dissolves in fats, so it's really nice if it's, in my experience, if it's mixed with coconut oil because it helps absorption. And it does taste a little bit like dirt, so the coconut oil helps the taste a little bit too. And some of them are flavored with safe flavorings, true natural flavorings. But in any event, I tend to use an oil that's in a liquid form, and I start with that. And that you can administer to a child. Many of the children I take care of don't swallow pills or capsules, so this can be mixed with any type of food or put in liquid, so it's a nice way to start, and you can start at a low dose and go up slowly. It's also available in paste form, which I do use the paste form at times. It's a more concentrated formulation, and normally a parent will squeeze it out of the tube. It's technically in a syringe. We'll squeeze it out in the size of a rice grain, and that's kind of the measurement. You know about how many milligrams are in there, but you know, just as a guideline, you'll start with 1 grain of rice, and then increase it slowly and until you get the clinical effect that you want. For people who can swallow capsules, it does come in capsule forms, and that can be very convenient if somebody's able to do that. And there are pure essential oil forms of CBD too. I have some experience with those personally, but I don't tend to use those with patients. I really get the result that I want with the 3 forms I mentioned before, and I find them appropriate and easy to use. One of the things with dosing CBD is to start low and increase slowly and monitor how the person is responding to it. And I think that we all do that, especially because our kids are so sensitive, and they sometimes have a really profound response to a very small amount of supplement or medicine. But the thing with the CBD and with the cannabis products in general is a little bit can go a long way. You know, you want to remember this is a balancing system. We're trying to get a system that regulates balance going. Too much is just going to cause more dysregulation. So I really, more than any other product I use, I go low and slow with this one. The formulation I happen to like, and I'll just mention that I started to learn about using CBD in my clinic, like I've learned so many things from a patient, from a family that had started to use it and were having really positive results with it. And then I got connected with Dr. John Hicks, who's been a big advocate of Autism 1, and unfortunately he passed away a couple of weeks ago quite unexpectedly of a heart attack. And I mention him, one, because I want to acknowledge how what a great mentor he was to me in beginning to use this and having a comfort level to use this with patients in my clinic. And he has an excellent book called It's at the end of the slide, at the end of the presentation, but the medicinal power of cannabis. And I recommend it highly for parents and practitioners. It's well referenced. It's a really, really nice read. It's excellent to get a conceptual understanding, and it's a great reference tool as well. And so I tend to use a product that he used because that's how I was introduced to it. And typical doses that I start with are 3 milligrams at bedtime. And again, we're trying to promote sleep. We're trying to promote modulation, and that happens when you're asleep, so I tend to dose it at bedtime. And I increase by 3 milligrams on a weekly basis. And typical doses, it'll vary by individual, but typical doses land somewhere between 12 to 24 milligrams, depending on the size of the person. And, doses can range between 2 milligrams and 200. CBD's been studied up to doses of 700 milligrams daily with no adverse side effects. And as I commented earlier, more is not necessarily better. Start low, go slow, and monitor for clinical effect. And so I wanted to finish just talking about a few cases where I had a lot of success in helping patients with their symptoms using the CBD. And the first is a 9-year-old girl who has regressive autism, and also when she was about 7, following a strep throat, developed what I mentioned earlier, which is PANS. Just a show of hands, has anybody heard of PANS before? Okay, all right, good. So most people know. But again, you get an infection, the immune system turns on to fight the infection, but gets confused and inappropriately directs its attack against the brain. And the symptoms that you experience when that happens are, we call them neuropsychiatric symptoms. So neurologic dysfunction and psychiatric symptoms, mood problems. I'm explaining this because the next 2 cases involve both autism and PANS. And anxiety and OCD are the hallmark symptoms, but anorexia can be present as well, a true lowering of the appetite where there's weight loss, and sometimes cachexia, which is they just become really malnourished. And then all kinds of neurologic symptoms that go with that mimic what we see in people who have an autism diagnosis: sensory problems, focus problems, and mood and behavior problems. So this little girl was experiencing not just her baseline ASD, but then had the PANS happen after a routine throat infection. And she was having a lot of trouble going to bed at night because any symptom from the immune system tends to get worse at night because of our circadian rhythm of our immune system. And so many PANS children have terrible fears that keep them from being able to fall asleep. They have to have a nighttime ritual, sleep in bed with their parents, and they're too afraid to fall asleep. And so we started CBD with her, like I mentioned, 3 milligrams, and then increased it. And when she hit 6 milligrams, she did a lot better. She didn't need her nighttime ritual anymore. She started sleeping, instead of 6 or 7 hours, 9 hours a night, staying asleep all night, and had a marked decrease in her anxiety and OCD symptoms as well. Which, when you think as a clinician, our options for treating psychiatric symptoms like that, anxiety and OCD, are what we call the SSRIs, Prozac, Zoloft. In children, we tend to use Zoloft. But in a child who has the issues that our children have, where their blood-brain barrier is not intact and anything that they take really gets up into the brain much more quickly than it's designed to, or inappropriately, it may not be designed to get there at all, really can have negative responses to pharmaceuticals. And again, as an MD, I use a fair amount of pharmaceuticals when they're appropriate. With our kids, I'm very low and slow for the reasons I said. But in children, I treat a lot of children with PANS and PANDAS in addition to autism, they do not do well on these typical medications for the symptoms that they're experiencing. And in fact, many of them worsen dramatically, where their motor tics and their mood problems and their behavior will worsen acutely when you give them sertraline and other medicines like it that we're used to using. So for me, finding CBD and having such a positive response with such an excellent safety profile was really, really exciting. The next case is a 6-year-old boy, and he did have a diagnosis of Asperger's. He was doing, fairly well. He had some challenges. His parents were into biomed, and he was on a clean diet and doing fairly well. I mean, he was doing well, and then he had an acute change in his function. We didn't know what the trigger was for sure at that time, but he became severely symptomatic with neuropsychiatric symptoms almost overnight. It was a matter of about 2 weeks. And he had a myriad of symptoms. I have here nausea and emetophobia because I wanted to talk about how successful I feel the CBD is for those particular problems, which again can be very, very big in both populations, autism and PANS. But he was so sick with anxiety and OCD and suffering at a physiological level so much with this GI distress, this nausea, anorexia, and this fear of vomiting all the time that he could barely function. He was suicidal. They had to hide all the kitchen knives. He was praying, very, prayerful, nice, wonderful family, that, God either take his life or help him. And he would, when he was going to bed, he would straighten his sheets for 2 hours before he could go to sleep because he couldn't have any wrinkles in the sheet. I mean, it's very severe OCD. And at the onset of these symptoms, he weighed about 60 pounds. And by the time he got to me, he weighed 50 pounds. So he'd lost 10 pounds and he only weighed 50 pounds. That's a lot of body weight. And this emetophobia is a very odd symptom, but it can be very profound. So it's this fear of vomiting, and most of us have vomited at least once in our life. That terrible feeling right before you vomit, and you're going to, is the feeling that he had every second of the day. And so that's why kids who are experiencing this won't eat. And this is coming from the brain, from the base of the brain, where your CB1 receptors are, where your spinal cord's coming out. And so we were trying a lot of things with him, and he wasn't responding very well. He was having a difficult time even taking the supplements and medications that I felt was important for him to take to start to get better. And so we started the CBD oil with him, and he responded to it. It took a couple of weeks, but he finally started to go to bed without as much ritual. He wasn't sleeping very well. He started to sleep much better, and again, that's such a big issue and so important when you can restore sleep. And then he started to be able to take food, number one, and then take medicines and supplements that were really important to help reverse what was unfolding. And in about 3 months, he gained back his 10 pounds, and about 3 months after that, he had gained 12 additional pounds. And he had resolution of the most severe anxiety, OCD symptoms, and he had a complete resolution of his nausea, anorexia, and emetophobia. Well, that makes sense since he gained 22 pounds back total. So again, really, really profound response to an extremely safe intervention. We ended up dosing him 6 milligrams twice a day because he was responding so well at bedtime, sleeping through the night, doing well, but then about halfway through the day, he'd start to get mounting anxiety. So we added a morning dose, and after about a week, that was all quiet, and he was having good days. And now he's maintained on that in addition to the other treatment that he's getting. And the last case I wanted to share with you is an 18-year-old young woman who had a vaccine injury and regressive ASD at 24 months of life, and her parents, very savvy, they've been in the biomed world, doing everything they could learn and know to do for 16 years with her. And she had an acute worsening in her function. We weren't really sure why, and it may have had to do with maturation and hormones and other things. And, in my experience, it was probably an infectious trigger with an inappropriate immune response because our kids are so fragile with how they'll respond to any environmental exposures, whether it's toxic or infectious. And so she developed severe anxiety, and she was suffering from profound insomnia. Again, that 1 to 3 hours at night. And there's complete exhaustion, but complete neural activation at the same time. And it's interesting because what, we say and we tell parents, and it's true, melatonin puts us to sleep and serotonin keeps us asleep. And one of the things that CBD does, I showed you how it binds to the CB receptors and controls and modulates and regulates things, but it also has regulatory effects on other receptors in the central nervous system, most notably dopamine and serotonin, which is called an HT receptor. And so I feel like that's one of the reasons that it helps so profoundly with sleep. And in this young woman, that was the first thing we did. We got her sleeping. Now, she was older than the other two kids, and her parents were very savvy and comfortable with moving a little faster, maybe even a little faster than I was comfortable with, but I was. And we went up quickly and got her to 25 milligrams twice a day. And it took about 4 weeks, and she had a major reduction in her anxiety, and that was on the heels of getting her sleep pattern restored. And again, all three of these children are still on the CBD oil, because in my clinical experience so far, it's important to keep supporting that system. We don't know all of the exact causes of autism, but I think everybody here feels like we're getting a pretty good idea. And the damage that happens to our children's nervous systems and immune systems, it takes a lot of time and intervention and healing before those systems can regulate themselves. And they may always need support. And in reality, all of us probably do need support of our endocannabinoid system. It's interesting because, endocannabinoids are in breast milk, so you get support, as an infant when you're breastfeeding from your mom. And then if we eat a wide variety of healthy, normal Mother Nature foods, we can support it, because the cannabinoids aren't just in cannabis, they're in lots of different foods. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. But our world is tough. Our environment is very toxic. Our food supply is toxic as well, and we have to be very savvy consumers. So to balance what our bodies are having to deal with in our modern world, I think routine support of the endocannabinoid system is a really smart thing to do. And I think I left about 5 minutes or so for questions, if any of you have them. And I'll point to this. This is the book that I referred to. You can get it on Amazon. And it's really, if you have an interest in this area, Dr. Hicks did a beautiful job in this book. I highly recommend it. And I think they're recording, but if you want any of this information, you can visit my website, and you can download the slides from there. So I'll take any questions. Yes. I haven't yet. I've been reading about it, but I haven't tried it. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, so I'll repeat the question because they're recording. And he asked if there are patients that I've encountered with ASD or PANS who are on GABA and 5-HTP and aren't responding. And those are both supplements that help with sleep because they affect the serotonin receptors. And GABA is very calming in the neuron. And if you add CBD, do they then respond? And the answer to that is yes. So that's part of, I have a little sleep cocktail. I usually add magnesium too. And the CBD can be a game changer. Yes? Yeah, so a lot of my parents, and I do this too with my daughter, we use an organic applesauce and mix things in there, or it can be any soft food that they like. So I just do a couple of squirts in there for her dose, mix it up in the applesauce, and she takes it that way. The kids it depends. It can be mixed with any food or liquid that they're willing to take. It does have a little bit of a dirt taste, and some of the kids kind of like that, but some children are more sensitive to that. So I just, the toughies I usually have mixed with raw honey, and because that masks most anything. Yes. Oh, okay, so that was where do I get my product from, and I'm not sure I'm allowed to say, but if nobody stops me, I'll say. So Dr. Hicks introduced me to Canavest, which is C-A-N-N-A, capital V-E-S-T, and their products are called Plus CBD oil. There's excellent vendors out in the hallway as well, and again, I'm just familiar with that company and comfortable, and I've seen good clinical results. But I think I should share with you, it's important to wherever you decide to get the CBD oil from, you want to be able to ask them to give you documentation of testing, because cannabis is a plant that will chelate out of the soil. It pulls what's in the soil into the plant. So it needs to be processed properly and tested for heavy metals, and you want to see that you're getting proper amounts of the cannabinoids in it, and the reputable manufacturers will happily provide that to you, and they do routine testing. All right. Oh, yes. Sure. No. Yeah, I mentioned that just briefly, but the CBD can also do that modulation around the dopamine receptor and around the 5-HT receptor, which is where serotonin binds. And in pandas, there's an autoimmune attack on the dopamine receptor, so the signaling around the receptor is really disrupted. And the CBD can stabilize the receptor so that it acts like it's supposed to. And that can decrease anxiety, decrease oppositional symptoms, and increase a sense of well-being, which the children experiencing pandas lack. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. Oh, I think it would be helpful, and I think the downside would be very low. In other words, I would try it. It's so safe. The worst I've seen it do is not seem to do anything. So, and for the reasons that we understand, for the really difficult problems with the dopamine receptor, I think it's a really nice thing to use. I mean, sometimes I use, and I'll use them in combination, low-dose naltrexone, which is geared at helping the dopamine receptor work like it's supposed to. It binds to it very briefly, stops binding from dopamine itself, and then falls off after about 3 hours. You dose it at bedtime, and that kind of resets the receptor. And so the CBD kind of conceptually would work the same way, but again, LDN, I like it. But it's a pharmaceutical, and the CBD's. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Oh, emetophobia. Mm-hmm. Yes. 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 Yeah, it's very possible, and it's so interesting with the kids who have pandas or pans, because yeah, yes, and but they're so verbal typically, right? And so for me in clinic, that was a big difference when these children, when they were better, they were able to tell me everything that they had been experiencing. And part of the disorder is the executive function and communication. So they don't share with their parents what they're actually experiencing. It's very difficult for them to articulate what's happening to them. But what you often see when they are actually experiencing emetophobia is food restriction and anorexia. So I would be, yes, and that is coming from the bottom of the brain. And yeah, and actually the cerebellum, there's a big thing there called the dorsal root ganglia, and you have a big nerve that comes off that, the vagus nerve, and when that gets stimulated and inflamed, you have the impending sense that you're going to vomit. And I mean, it's such a bad feeling. They really just feel terrible. And if you can relieve that for them and they start eating, it's a really big intervention. Yeah, and then, it's very hard to get anything better when somebody's not eating nutritiously. Yeah. Yes.
So would flaxseed oil work? I don't think we're talking about that. A couple years ago, having cannabinoids.
There's black pepper has cannabinoids in it. The answer I think to that is no, not in the way that we're looking for, because the thing with the CBD oil is it's highly concentrated. So there are trace amounts in many plant products, but we're looking for the highly concentrated amount to get the effect to help the system. So I like flax in general nutritionally, but I don't think it would provide enough of the cannabinoids. Yeah, I guess I'd have to look and see what the amount of the of any cannabinoid was in the flax. But I don't want to promote one vendor over another, but there are different price points, and I think that if you find, like Cannavest, in terms of the supplementation I do generally in the office and what people pay for probiotics for a really good form of probiotic, it's actually reasonable. Some are much more expensive than others, and I think if you visit Cannavest and other vendors, you'll find a similar price point, and it's manageable for families. Oh, I have a devotion to Saint Teresa, and so she's also called the Little Flower. Okay, well that seems, oh, yes? Yes. Yes, and yes, our kids are very sensitive and very unpredictable. With the CBD, we do it at bed. I know from trying it myself, you can feel a little spacey the first few times you take it, almost like super relaxed. And so we dose it at bedtime, so that doesn't seem to be a problem for the kids. But along those lines, a sprinkle, in my mind, is a legitimate dose. And in very sensitive kiddos, I tell the parents, open up the capsule, put it into a little Ziploc bag, and you start with a sprinkle. And we may take a month to get up to one capsule. So a child that, has that kind of opposite intended effect with GABA that's supposed to be calming, it might have just been the amount. And you can start really low and go up really slowly. Yes? Mm-hmm. It had the opposite effect. The same thing as if I gave him Benadryl, he'll bounce off the walls, but if I give him a cup of coffee, he's like, I'm good for an hour. Yes, and I really like what you said there. And again, it's a regulatory mechanism, and we can throw the regulation off. And it's beyond the scope of my practice because, as I mentioned, I can't use THC. But there's many speakers here over the next couple of days that are in states where they use medicinal marijuana, and there's a lot of value to the THC, and there's different ratios where you may have a certain amount of the endocannabinoids, the CBD, say, maybe 100 parts to 1 part of THC. But it's a really crucial regulatory substance. So, I'll be honest, if that was available to me, I would have more options, for individual patients. But given my limitations, I found that the CBD works best for the things that I shared with you. Yeah, good. Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, and it's really exciting because it's very individualized medicine. You can find out what works just for that person. Okay, well, thank you so much for your attention. I hope you have a good evening.